Resident Evil is my favorite horror franchise in gaming and one of my favorite franchises overall, and Resident Evil 2 Remake was my game of the year for 2019, so to say that I was excited for Resident Evil 3 Remake would be a bit of an understatement. After 2.5 playthroughs of RE3, I can safely say that this game is not going to be my game of the year, but it will probably still make it on the list. I do want to be clear though that I have never played the original RE3 or for that matter the original RE2, so I didn't bring any preconceived expectations for how the remake would be. Generally speaking, it seems to me that people who haven't played the original RE3 have really enjoyed the remake, whereas people who have played the original game were disappointed with some of the cuts and changes made in this game. There are certain things about the game that I also would say are a little disappointing, but overall I very much enjoyed the game. Let's get into it. I played Resident Evil 3 Remake on Xbox One S. I played it on Standard the first playthrough, which is the normal difficulty, Hardcore on the second playthrough, which is the hard mode, and I started a third playthrough on Nightmare, which is very hard mode, but didn't end up finishing that one, and I'll explain why in the video. This video will be spoiler free for the most part. RE3 looks fantastic all around. Character models are highly detailed with great animations. The lighting is great with various light sources such as fires or neon signs all looking incredibly realistic with the light they put out. The game has a great atmosphere that differs from RE2, where in that game the city had already fallen into ruin by the time Leon and Claire got there. Jill is witnessing the destruction as it happens, so the game has a more sort of visceral feel to it. RE2 had this weird sort of haziness to the graphics at certain points, but that's completely gone with RE3, which I think is an improvement. The map from RE2 returns and is just as good as it was in that game. Rooms or areas that have items left in them or things left to do in them are red, and if you've either interacted with an item or gone near it, it shows up on the map. Rooms or areas that have been cleared of all items or interactable elements are blue, letting you know that you're done with that area. It really is such a handy tool that I can't really imagine playing an RE game without it at this point. It's not all good with the graphics, however. If an enemy is far enough away from the player, the game drops their animation frames. This is very noticeable and quite distracting, as the distance that they have to be to switch to these low frame animations is not that far at all. Personally, I hate when games do this as it just takes me out of the game. RE2 had a pretty substantial gore system where you could shoot at specific parts of zombies such as their arms or legs and the model would react accordingly, losing limbs realistically and they would stay on the ground. But in RE3 the system has been downgraded, so now limbs just kind of explode off and disappear. Some of the lip syncing in game can be quite wonky, but I'd give it a pass if it weren't for the fact that some cutscenes also have some legitimately bad lip syncing. Like it's not even close to being right. It's very bizarre. I don't think I've seen such a big game have some lip syncing this bad in a long time. I mean, for 90% of the cutscenes the lip syncing is done well, but that makes the cutscenes that do have bad lip syncing stand out even more. I know it seems like I was being pretty critical of the game's graphics, but it does genuinely look amazing. It just has a few issues that are worth pointing out. The biggest issue of the graphics for me, however, is the performance. The game aims for 60 frames per second across all platforms, but on the Xbox One S it rarely ever hits that. It has a completely uncapped frame rate, which was one of my problems with RE2. Generally, the frame rate ranges from the low 50s to the low 30s, which is a pretty big range. I appreciate that Capcom are going for that sweet 60 frames per second, unlike some other big publishers, but I would also really appreciate an option to cap the frame rate at 30 FPS, because a frame rate that varies this much just feels bad to play. The sound design is very good. The enemies sound monstrous, guns sound powerful, and the ambience of exploring the game's various locations is done very well. I think the soundtrack is pretty great, and from what I understand has a few songs from the original game that were remade for this game. I'm not actually sure how many songs are from the original game and how many songs are new, as I couldn't find any information about that, but whatever the situation is, the soundtrack is really good. RE3 takes place in Raccoon City a couple months after RE1 and begins before RE2 but ends after the ending of RE2. You get all that? The story in Resident Evil games has never really been the main focal point for me. I think that most of the games in the series I've played had decent stories for what the game was trying to do, but I don't think of amazing storytelling or characters first when I think about Resident Evil. The plot is that an outbreak of the T-virus from the first game takes place in Raccoon City, turning most of the population into zombies. At the same time, Umbrella sends the Nemesis monster to kill the surviving members of the STARS team from the Arclay Mansion incident, i.e. the first game of which Jill is one. So the broad strokes of the story are that Jill needs to escape from Raccoon City and survive Nemesis. The game begins with the nightmare sequence for Jill in her apartment. It's clear from some of the readable notes strewn about that she's become a little bit paranoid after unsuccessfully trying to bring Umbrella to justice. As it turns out, her paranoia is wholly justified as Nemesis bursts through her apartment wall to try and kill her. What follows is a frenetic chase sequence where Jill is fleeing for her life. Jill is eventually rescued by Carlos after he manages to incapacitate Nemi with a rocket launcher. Carlos, who is the second playable character, is part of the Umbrella Biohazard Countermeasure Service, or UBCS for short, which is a mercenary team employed by Umbrella to handle any biohazard outbreaks. The team were sent in to deal with the T-virus outbreak, but most of them had been wiped out by the time Jill runs into them. Jill is convinced by their leader Mikhail to help them in evacuating civilians by turning the power to the subway back on. There isn't much to spoil for the story, but I'm gonna stop here for specifics. I can't speak to how Jill was originally portrayed in the original game and what changes were made to her character in the remake, but I liked her character in this game. She initially treats Carlos and the other members of the UBCS with hostility and distrust, which is completely understandable considering what she's recently been through at the hands of Umbrella. But as we continue through the story, Jill does eventually realize that Carlos and the others genuinely aren't aware of Umbrella's part in the fall of Raccoon City or Nemesis, and warms up to them. Well, except for Nikolai. Fuck Nikolai. Some of her dialogue does come off a little bit more on the cringy side, or like the writers were trying too hard to make her seem like a badass, but overall I think it works and I genuinely liked her and Carlos's chemistry. Carlos is easily likable as his sense of humor genuinely brought out a chuckle for me more than once, and his afro is pretty legit too. So legit that the first time I saw his model from the first game I think I had a Vietnam flashback. I like the other characters too, but you don't really spend enough time with Mikhail or Tyrell to get attached to them beyond just liking them from a surface level. And while I wouldn't say Nikolai is a bad villain, he's not very memorable for me or unique. So even though I haven't played the original RE3, I do know of some of the changes that have been made for the remake, both in story and gameplay. One of the changes made to the story is the removal of the live selection system, which basically let players make snap decisions that would change certain things about the story and certain gameplay scenarios. This was sort of like a branching path system which added some replay value to the game. From what I understand, it wasn't anywhere near an RPG level of choice, but it was still something, and it sucks that it was removed for the remake. Resident Evil 2 Remake had two campaigns, one for Leon and one for Claire. Both campaigns had a few differences from the other, nothing too crazy, but it was still a nice incentive for a second playthrough of the game. But RE3 doesn't have that. It's the same campaign every time, which I normally wouldn't have an issue with, as I don't think linearity in video game stories is inherently a bad thing, but having the knowledge that the live selection system existed and wasn't used in the remake kind of left a bit of a bad taste in my mouth considering how short the game is. I beat the game on my first playthrough in under 6 hours, and on my subsequent playthrough I beat it even faster. Again, just like linearity in storytelling, I don't think a short game length is automatically a negative if the quality of the game is there. I think story and games should be as long or short as they need to be, and honestly, the older I get and the less time I have to play video games, the more I appreciate a game that doesn't stretch out its game length with pointless filler like so many RPGs and open world games tend to do. However, again, knowing that they could have implemented the live selection system to add replayability to such a short game but chose not to just rubs me the wrong way. This game is very fast paced, so much so that it kind of reminded me of Resident Evil 6 more than once. Now, I actually genuinely liked Resident Evil 6 a lot. RE6 is an absolutely batshit crazy balls to the wall action game and I love it because of that. But that isn't necessarily what I want Resident Evil to be. RE6 happened and I enjoyed it for what it was, but I don't know if I ever want it to happen again. The Resident Evil formula is still prevalent here, i.e. exploring interconnected environments while scavenging for supplies and either shooting or avoiding zombies. This formula, however, is more condensed and in smaller bursts than in the previous two RE games. Each area you get to explore, of which there are a few, aren't as big or expansive as I was expecting, and you don't spend as much time as you usually would in each location in other RE games. I was really enjoying exploring Raccoon City until I realized that the handful of streets and buildings we could enter was all there was to it. And basically, as soon as I came to that realization, the game decided that we were done with Raccoon City and moved on to the next location. There's around 4 locations in the game, and you roughly spend about an hour, give or take, in each of them. It's definitely a little disappointing, as I never really felt like I got to sink my teeth into each location. It felt more like we were just passing through on a short detour. It's even more disappointing when you consider that there were a few locations that were cut entirely from the first game, and even the ones that weren't cut still had sizable chunks that didn't make it into the remake for whatever reason. It really seems to me that the priority for the dev team was to make a more fast-paced, action-heavy game, but I don't see why they had to cut so much from the original to achieve that. The shooting feels good, and there's a good amount of weapons on offer here. There's the knife, which is a full weapon again and not a consumable like in RE2, the handgun, the shotgun, grenades, flash grenades, the burst handgun, the magnum, and Carlos has the assault rifle. Jill does have access to the assault rifle, but it only appears in the campaign if you play on the easiest difficulty. There are unlockable weapons you can buy from the game shop, like the infinite handgun or rocket launcher. Thankfully, the shop in-game does not use real money, rather you can get points to buy things by completing in-game challenges. Most guns have upgrades that will do things like improve accuracy or ammo capacity, which can be very helpful. And the grenade launcher has multiple ammo types like in RE2. It has fire rounds, explosive rounds, mine rounds, and acid rounds. As I just mentioned, you can craft ammo similar to most other RE games. You can find gunpowder and high-grade gunpowder to craft ammo for your handguns and shotgun, and the grenade launcher has its own gunpowder called explosive A or B to craft ammo. I found that on both standard and hardcore difficulty, the game gave you more than enough ammo, and I almost never crafted ammo and had a sizable amount stashed in the item box at the end of both playthroughs. So along with the knife no longer being a consumable comes the removal of the sub-weapon system from RE2 entirely. In RE2, whenever you were grabbed by an enemy, you could press the LB button to escape from the grab as long as you had a sub-weapon in your inventory, the sub-weapons being a knife, grenade, or flash grenade. This would consume the item but would prevent you from taking damage. It was a good system that forced you to choose between whether you wanted to save that item for later in case you needed it, or if you were running low on healing items, it was essentially a get-out-of-jail-free card. Zombies still grabbed you the same way as they did in RE2, but now you just either tap or hold a button depending on what your settings are, but you still get chomped by the zomb no matter what. In place of the sub-weapon system is the dodge mechanic, which was also in the original RE3. If you perform a perfect dodge, you can enter a slow-motion shooting opportunity that automatically locks you onto an enemy's weak spot and basically lets you get a few free shots in. I found that the dodge mechanic was a little bit tricky to get the hang of, but once I did come to grips with it, dodging zombies was relatively reliable, although it did seem like sometimes the dodge wasn't as consistent as it should be. Jill gets staggered for too long after she's damaged by an enemy, sometimes resulting in multiple chained attacks that can kill you when you're at full health, because you don't have a chance to regain control of Jill and avoid them. This doesn't feel like a punishment because I failed to dodge, it makes the game sometimes feel cheap and bullshitty. There's a few things that I found annoying in RE2 that have carried over to RE3, and while I tolerated them in that game, for whatever reason they bothered me a lot more in this one, maybe because I was hoping they wouldn't be in the next game. Zombies play dead often, and while I don't have an issue when a zombie is already on the ground when you enter a new area and you have to either shoot it or stab it to check whether it's actually down, zombies will routinely fall to the ground after you've shot them a few times and act like they're completely down when they are clearly not. If it only happened every once in a while, it wouldn't be so bad, but it happens all the fucking time. The problem is that it seems like sometimes a zombie will be immune to damage for a few seconds after crumbling to the ground, so you just have to wait until the game decides you can damage them again. It's not scary, it's not tense, it's just tedious. I know you're not fucking dead yet. Who are you trying to fool, huh? I'm the only one here, dumbass. Jill, just like Leon and Claire before her, seems to think that the fastest speed she can reach when she's being chased by a fucking 8-foot-tall actual monster is a light jog. I understand that survival horror requires certain restrictions on what the player can do, but at least for the chase sequences, they really should have increased the running speed, because it just looks and feels stupid to have Jill move so slowly when she's supposed to be running for her life. A few other issues issues I have are that in a couple of the boss fights with Nemesis, the camera zooms in really close behind Jill, making it more difficult to judge the distance between her and Nemesis, therefore making it more difficult to correctly time a dodge. It also just lowers the field of view in a way that doesn't really increase the intensity of the fight, it's just irritating to have your FOV arbitrarily limited. Speaking of Nemesis, he sort of just feels a little bit inconsequential, to be honest. He only shows up a handful of times throughout the game, and half of those times are boss fights. The other half happen in Raccoon City in the first hour or two of the game, but even then each of his appearances are either heavily scripted or triggered at certain parts of the game. I never really felt like Nemesis was actively stalking me like I did with Mr. X and RE2. Once Mr. X shows up, he's basically in the police station until you leave. But aside from a couple trigger points where he always shows up, he dynamically follows you in the RPD. He felt much more threatening and scary than Nemesis to me because you knew that he was actually moving around somewhere in the RPD trying to find you as a permanent NPC, as opposed to Nemesis who only shows up once the story decides it's time for him to show up. There's also too many times where Nemesis could easily kill Jill just by snapping her neck or crushing her head, but just doesn't for whatever fucking reason. Like if it happened once or twice for dramatic effect, I'd let it slide, but it happens so many times that it just makes him look like he can't do his fucking job right. Now, I'd like to tell you that throughout my time with the game, I encountered no bugs or glitches or crashes, but I can't tell you that because it would be a lie. What I can say is that for my first two playthroughs, it was true, but on my third playthrough on Nightmare difficulty, the game kind of just broke. Like it completely fucking broke. When I got to the point where Nemesis chases you with the rocket launcher, I noticed that the environment hadn't fully loaded. I thought, that was weird, but kept playing till I got killed by Nemi. Then I noticed that the generally fast loading time to respawn was way longer than it usually was, and began with this black screen that stayed for a while that I hadn't seen before. And from there, all hell broke loose. For the next half hour, I tried to get past this section, but kept running into new problems that prevented that from happening. Nemi spawned without his rocket launcher, the level didn't spawn, enemies wouldn't spawn, until finally I managed to get past the choke point, only to be greeted with this. There's supposed to be a cutscene here where Carlos helps Jill escape, which didn't play, and then after the cutscene, Carlos is supposed to be there and open the door for Jill. But he didn't spawn, and so I couldn't progress further. I tried reloading the save a couple times before this point, but it didn't fix anything. So I said, fuck it I guess, and stopped playing on my third playthrough. I checked on the Resident Evil subreddit, and it turns out that a few other people had the same thing happen to them. Some people seem to think it's caused by the game not being able to load fast enough, which causes it to just go rogue, but I can't say for sure that's what it is. I didn't try loading an earlier save because I was already pretty done with the game, not in the sense of I was sick of it, but more like I had gotten my RE fill and was satisfied, like a nice tasty meal. I'm sure if I had loaded an earlier save, I would have continued without issue. I know it seems like I've been pretty harsh on the gameplay side of things, but the game still feels as good to play as RE2 does, and I genuinely enjoyed the majority of my time with the game. It just has more warts and zits than RE2 did. Resident Evil 3 comes with Resident Evil Resistance, which is a multiplayer mode that was apparently being developed on its own but ended up being bundled with RE3. I suspect that Capcom realized that RE3 wasn't as substantial as the last few RE games and decided to add Resistance as a way of bolstering the package. Resistance is an asymmetrical multiplayer mode where a team of 4 players acting as survivors try to make it to the end of a level while a 5th player takes on the role of a mastermind to try and stop them from escaping within the time limit. I'm not much of a multiplayer guy, but even I could tell that this mode is pretty bad. It feels like it was rushed out the door just to coincide with the release of RE3. The games are really unbalanced. Either the survivors will make it to the end of the level with very little issues, or the mastermind will steamroll survivors, giving them no chance at escaping. Playing as a survivor feels tedious as the main gameplay loop is looking for items you need to advance to the next phase of the level. But item locations are randomized, meaning you never know where the items will be, and each survivor has their own unique abilities, but unless you're playing as the one survivor who can heal other survivors and has the ability to see the items you need in the map, you might as well not be playing as a survivor because all the other abilities are nowhere near as useful. I found playing as a mastermind to be more fun, as it's basically like a tower defense game where you can spawn in zombies and take control of them. You can even take control of boss enemies like Mr. X or William Birkin, but the NPCs you can spawn are randomly selected, so you never know what you're gonna get. Overall, this mode just feels like an undercooked, half-assed mode meant to make up for the lack of content in the single-player campaign. But I think I speak for everyone when I say that I would have rather had the development time and money spent on Resistance gone into the campaign. Because seriously, nobody asked for this, nobody wanted it, and no one is going to be playing it in a couple months. Resident Evil 3 is by no means a bad game. In fact, I think it's a pretty good game and I enjoyed it a lot, but I find it easy to sympathize with people who are disappointed with the remake aspect of the game when you take into consideration how much of the original game has either been changed or left out. It's a little difficult for me to decide on a rating with that in mind, but at the end of the day, the game looks amazing even though it has a few technical issues, the story and characters are good, albeit nothing too special, and the gameplay, while having a slew of minor annoyances, is still the same fantastic gameplay from RE2. I'm going to give Resident Evil 3 an 8 out of 10. Capcom has already stated that an RE4 remake is in development for 2022, and RE8 is supposed to be released in 2021. As big of a fan of the series as I am, I don't think I want Resident Evil to be a yearly franchise like FIFA or Call of Duty. I'd prefer a release every 2 years at most because I want each game to feel special and that each game gets the development time it needs. But putting all that aside, if you enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a like, subscribing, and comment your thoughts on Resident Evil 3 Remake. Thanks for watching.